Hello there. Welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chester Chidallo.
Coming up this week, do facts stand a chance against spin and fake news? Why am I even asking that question? We will ask an expert on threats to democracy, though.
And I'm going to be looking at the crime wave that isn't. But first...
Well, the presidential primaries are effectively over with Joe Biden and Donald Trump, the presumptive nominees of their parties once again. The elections continued this week and there were some very significant results. Down ballot, as they say. Control of the United States Senate will be on the line this November, with Democrats battling to hang on to their single vote majority. And one of the most likely Republican pickups seemed to be in the increasingly conservative state of Ohio. The Buckeye state was a swing state for decades. It was also a bellwether presidentially, voting for every successful presidential candidate for 60 years until Donald Trump broke that streak in 2020, won Ohio, lost the election. Well, the Democrat Senator Sherrod Brown has managed to hold on to his seat in Ohio as it has turned increasingly red over recent years, partly because of his strong personal following amongst the working class of that state. Partly as well, you have to say, Sherrod Brown's just been a bit lucky. His 6-year terms and the election cycles have coincided nicely with a blue wave year in 2006 against George W. Bush. Then there was Obama's strong showing in the 2012 elections. He was on the ballot that year. And then the anti-Trump midterm backlash of 2018. That all helped Sherrod Brown hold on to his seat. This week we learned that his opponent this November will be Republican Bernie Moreno. He sailed to a surprisingly comfortable primary win.
Moreno won with more than 50% of the vote and notably won every single county in Ohio.
It was certainly pretty notable. Bernie Moreno is a former car dealer, a self-made businessman in the Trump mold who has tied himself very closely to Trump, winning his endorsement.
I wear with honor my endorsement of from President Trump. I wear that with a badge of honor. Because under President Trump, this nation was safer, it was more secure, we had prosperity around the world, we had generationally low interest rates, and we had generationally low inflation.
That's Bernie Moreno. Well, Senate Democrats already had this ad out attacking Moreno literally minutes after he was declared the primary winner.
Meet Bernie Moreno. Even Republicans don't trust him.
This is why this man can't be trusted.
I don't know if we can trust you.
Bernie would overrule Ohio voters to pass a national abortion ban.
Absolute pro-life, no exceptions.
And he was sued by employees because he didn't pay them overtime they'd earned and destroyed evidence to get out of it.
You shredded those documents because it helped Bernie Moreno, not the employees.
To put it simply,
this is a matter of trust.
Republicans don't trust Bernie Moreno. Why should you?
Yeah, they make him out to sound pretty bad, but it's fair to say Democrats wanted Bernie Moreno to win over his more moderate Republican rivals. State Senator Matt Dolan had the backing of the Republican governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine, who's very much a pre-Trump era sort of centrist Republican, very popular in the state still. And they now think that Sherrod Brown has his best possible chance of holding on to this seat in November because he's up against Bernie Moreno. Sherrod Brown is such an interesting character because he's increasingly out of step with voters in Ohio, but he has got this strong personal following. There's some talk he might even run for president back in 2020. He's kind of like a blue-collar Bernie Sanders or something.
Yeah, he's a classic economic populist, which should do well in the Rust Belt. It certainly does better than the cultural issues at the very least. But You're totally right about the Democrats wanting Moreno to be the candidate. And I'll tell you how you know this. You just ran an attack ad. I've got another attack ad for you from the Democrats that they ran during the Republican primary. This is their favourite trick. Whenever there's someone who they want elected for the Republican nomination, they run an attack ad that's actually promoting that candidate to their supporters. So watch this ad. This is paid for by Democrats. An attack ad supposedly on Moreno. Ask yourself, would this ad have been any different if Moreno ran it himself?
MAGA Republican Bernie Moreno is too conservative for Ohio. In Washington, Moreno would do Donald Trump's bidding. That's why Trump endorsed Moreno, calling him exactly the type of MAGA fighter that we need in the United States Senate. Moreno would lead the charge to enact Trump's MAGA agenda to repeal Obamacare and institute a national ban on abortion. Donald Trump needs Bernie Moreno. Ohio doesn't.
Donald Trump needs Marino, this ad said. Okay, so...
It's a clever ad because it plays to the base that helped elect Marino, but it also tells moderate voters and Democrats that this guy is tied to Donald Trump. So it does two things at once.
Yeah.
Once for now, once for November.
Yeah, so the question is, why do they back this guy so much, Democrats? Why they think he's a weaker opposition than Dolan? Okay, there's a couple of things. First of all, I mean, you mentioned that Dolan's more establishment. That's definitely the case. Dolan is moderate, which is better in an election, presumably. Also, Dolan's very rich. He owns the Cleveland Major League Baseball team. Okay, he's a very rich guy, which means he can fund himself. We're going to be talking about money in a second. Money's going to be an issue this year. This guy could fund himself, and he has lots of rich mates who would write donations, write checks for him as well. On top of that, the polls are very, very clear. There have been 4 polls this month. All of them, Dolan polls at least 3 points better in comparison to Sherrod Brown than Marino did. Some of them he polls by even more.
A lot of polls had Dolan doing much better against Bernie Marino in the lead up to the primary as well. Some of the polls in the last week had him in front and he got nowhere close. So goodness knows what these polls are, what's going on with them.
Yeah, so like you say though, that this may well put Ohio in play. Ohio is, in 2022, is 6 points more Republican than the rest of America. So if you do the math, let's say Joe Biden has a narrow victory, let's say. And so let's say he wins by 2 or 3 points. That means Ohio is 3 points to the red. This Marino character is 3 points weaker than Dolan. So this single-handed decision may well make Ohio a 50-50 state when it shouldn't have been.
Yeah, and so with Bernie Marino, unlike Sherrod Brown, who has been known for a very, very long time, there's a lot that people don't know about this guy. And it was a pretty willing primary campaign, and a lot of dirt was being dug as well.
Yes, there was. I know where you're going. It's amazing we've gotten this far without using the word adult friend finder, because that was the entire last week of the campaign. It came out, about a week and a half ago that there was an account created, an adult friend finder in 2008.
It's a dating site.
This is an all-purpose kind of site, dating, friends, whatever. In this case, the account suggested it was for, well, I'll tell you what it said. Quote, men for one-on-one sex. Bio read, hi, looking for young guys to have fun with while travelling. Now, this account there was no profile picture. The username was Nardo19672. Bernardo is his first name. He was born in February 1967, Marino. It also used Marino's email address. We know that because there was a data breach, so we know the details of it. Also, it had a geolocation data there that was set up near Marino's parents' place.
So the suggestion is Bernie Marino set up a profile on a match-up website looking for gay sex 10 years ago?
16 years ago.
16 years ago.
Yeah, and it was only active for 6 hours, this account. He has a staffer who came forward, an ex-staff who said, I set it up as a prank.
Right.
And he's sworn that there was a prank, and there's no reason for us to believe otherwise, but prove it. It's like I say, it's become a big issue. Why is this an issue, you might ask? Are we all just homophobes now? No, the reason why this is an issue is because, first of all, Bernie Marino himself, he has a gay son, and he was very pro-gay rights until 2020. And then all of a sudden, when he first ran for the Senate in 2021, he became not so pro-gay rights. And he's actually been running these days, running quite hard against LGBTQ people, in particular trans people. And he's run attack ads against his adversaries about trans issues.
Right.
And so there's a real hypocrisy angle going on here.
I see.
So we don't know how this is going to play, but it's not going to go away. This is the kind of gutter snipe kind of issue that just doesn't disappear during an election. So we'll see how this all plays out. I just want to just very quickly just point out why we're talking about this, why Ohio is so important. Democrats currently have 51 seats in the Senate. Now they're facing, dare I say, a bloodbath in the election this year. Republicans could potentially end up with 56 or 57 seats because there's a lot of defending being done by Democrats in narrowly won seats. But if we just look through it quickly, West Virginia is gone. Okay, there's no way Democrats are going to keep that. So let's call that 50-50 Senate. Then there are a bunch of 50-50 seats. Like there are, let's assume the Republicans hold Florida or Texas. It'd be very hard for Democrats to win either of them. The 50-50 seats are Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada, New Jersey. I'll talk about that in a sec. Wisconsin. Democrats could lose all of them or none of them, depending on how well the election goes. That still leaves us, let's say Democrats have a good election. That leaves us at 50-50 still. There's still 2 more seats. Montana and Ohio. Now, both those states are going to be hard for the Democrats to win. They've got a popular candidate in John Tester in Montana, but it's a very red state. We don't know how that's going to go. Ohio, until recently, people have written off. But if it's now in play, the Democrats get that much closer to potentially, if Biden wins the election, holding the Senate, which 3 months ago you would have said is impossible. But maybe it's not.
Yeah, maybe not. A bit of a wild card, though, has been dealt into all of that because the state of New Jersey, which they would have been confident of retaining their Senate seat there, except that their incumbent Democratic Senator, Senator Bob Menendez, is accused of a bunch of federal corruption charges, taking a whole lot of bribes from businessmen in the state involving his now wife. He's also accused of being a lobbyist, well, not even a lobbyist, a foreign agent for Egypt and doing their bidding while he was on as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So he's got to explain away in court in May why he had all these gold bars and this Mercedes car given to him by these Egyptians with business ties, but also foreign entanglement. So he's now announced he's not going to run in the Democratic primary for re-election. He already had a couple of challenges. Andy Kim, the congressman, Tammy Murphy, the First Lady, wife of Phil Murphy, the popular New Jersey governor. Menendez was only getting about 9 or 10% in recent polls. So no wonder that he's dropping out of the Democratic primary. But he's now saying if he's exonerated by the court case, which is a big if, that he will run as an independent Senate candidate come this November. That could spell big problems for Democrats. Yeah, it really could. I should say, by the way, the reason why he might want to run as independent, not only because he can't win the Democrat primary, but on top of that, he needs less signatures. He only needs 800 signatures by June 4 to be independent, as opposed to 1,000 signatures by March 25 to be a Democrat. Also, this is the important thing. If he's an independent, he doesn't even need to be trying to win. He can just be raising money for his legal fees. Yeah, right. Because he's got a lot of legal fees. It's the Trump playbook. Yeah. So I suspect that's why he wants to run as independent. He's broke, essentially. Yeah. Now, why this matters? Because 2 things. Number one, New Jersey is normally blue. Like, normally Democrats win by 8, 9 points, even 10 points. But if Menendez as an independent only wins 6 or 7%, it turns it into a 50-50 seat, which is why I counted it as a 50-50 seat before. And secondly, even if he only gets 1% or 2%, Democrats aren't going to want to take any chances. They're going to want to fund the campaign against him to make sure he doesn't get votes. That's taking money from Ohio and from Montana and from all the other states they have to defend. So the Democrats really don't need this. Yeah. Well, interesting to see how that one plays out. Now, we're going to be heading off on a break over the Easter period. So a good chance for us to take a quick look at the state of the race, where the presidential polls are up to at the moment. Not great news for President Biden. In the 2 weeks since he delivered his State of the Union address, he's actually fallen 1 percentage point head-to-head in the average of polls. At the same time, former President Trump has fallen 1% head-to-head. So the difference between the 2 points is Trump's lead, and that has been maintained. So no State of the Union bounce, even though Biden was seen to have done reasonably well. Trump has now been in front of these head-to-head national polls, which, as we often say, is not really a great indication of anything other than the popular vote, because it's all about the 6 or 7 battleground states. But still, Biden has not been in front since last September, and the way the Electoral College works, he probably wants to be 2 or 3 points in front to feel as though he's going to win those crucial states on the popular vote.
Absolutely. Although I do want to make a couple of points about that Real Clear Politics average that you cited before. Those averages are a bit distorted by an 8-point Trump lead to Rasmussen, which is a slightly dodgy polling company, and a 7-point Trump lead from Grinnell, who I've never even heard of, whoever the hell they are.
Yeah.
And
they've been around for a while, but they're not. And Real Clear Politics has been, some other poll aggregators have been knocking Rasmussen out of their averages because they've had a few outliers like this that suggest they're not spending enough money on their polling.
Yeah, and I would say if you count up all the polls, even counting Grinnell and Rasmussen, in the Real Clear Politics average from February, Trump was winning 17 of them, Biden was winning 2 of them, and there was a tie in 2.
Yep.
In March so far, Trump's winning 7, Biden's winning 4, and there's a tie in 1. So, I mean, Trump's still ahead, but I actually think Biden may have closed the gap just slightly, I suspect, just slightly, like the tiny little bounce. But the important thing for me about these polls is that there's a very clear trend, which is that Biden is not winning over Democrats at this point in time. And what I'm referring to there, I've got some data here. In YouGov polls, about 85% of Democrats approve of Biden, whereas for Trump at the moment, it's 90%. In Gallup polls, 80% support Biden. With Trump, it's 92%. In Marquette Law School polls, 86% back Trump. Only 79% of Democrats back Biden, and so on. It goes on. It happens over and over again. Now, this means one of 2 things. Number one, most likely scenario is the Democrats will come home. They'll wake up. When
it'll be 90% by election day.
Yeah, exactly. That's the most likely scenario. In which case, you need to give Biden a couple more points, which means we're probably a 50-50 contest yet again. They are, and that's the most likely scenario. Yep. The less likely scenario is maybe they're never going to come home. There's a reason they haven't come home yet. And we're looking at a landslide to Trump. I think that's pretty unlikely. But I just want to flag it is possible. Basically, we'll know in another couple of months. Are those Democrats coming home to Biden or not? Yeah. And if they are, it's going to be another squeeze.
And if the combined forces of Donald Trump and the issue of abortion are not enough to get those Democrats to come home, then you wonder what has happened to the party. Maybe they've just decided they are, in fact, the party of Bernie Sanders, not Joe Biden, and they're discontent from 4 years of Biden, and they think, well, we have another disruptive influence in Donald Trump. But of course, polls are one thing, but where people are putting their money is another very good indicator.
This is the poll that counts, the poll of who wants to give me lots of money. If we look at what we got so far, Trump's campaign just announced that when you add both his campaign and his joint fundraising committee's money together, you get $20 million raised in February, and they got $42 million cash on hand at the end of February. Whereas Biden and his joint fundraising committee have raised $53 million in February, and they've got $155 million on hand at the end of the month. Now, that's not 100% apples and apples comparison, but it's pretty close. They're going to need that money. Like, the analysts have predicted about $2.7 billion in advertising spending just on the presidential campaign this year. Biden's super PACs have already committed $450 million. They've already booked $450 million of ads already in this race. So they're going to go through money like it's no one's business. So Trump would be concerned about those numbers.
Yeah, and if you're a voter in Michigan, you'd be thinking of moving to Utah around about now. You know, there's a lot of talk about the Trump campaign saying, no, we're not going to be taking money from the RNC to pay for Trump's legal bills. Well, we've now seen the reality of that situation. They're not taking money from the RNC, but now fundraising activities are joint fundraising activities between the RNC and the Save America PAC. So if you're going to a rubber chicken dinner sometime soon at Mar-a-Lago, you're going to find that half the money's going to the RNC and half of it is going to Trump's legal fees. So they're not giving it to the legal fees, it's going direct for legal fees.
The problem with that is that donors might be thinking to themselves, well, why am I going to donate to Republicans? It's just going to Trump's legal fees. Now, some Republicans would love to donate to Trump's legal fees, but not all of them will. Yeah. And that will make a difference. And the other thing is, Trump is doing much worse on small donors in particular than Joe Biden is. And small donors are the most important donors because when you have hundreds of thousands of small donors, they keep on giving. Yep. Whereas the big donors, They only get so many shots, and that's it.
Right now, Trump is looking for 1 million donors to chip in $500 each to pay his legal liabilities in New York State. He's only got a couple of days to find that cool $500 million. On this week's Planet America, we did take a deep dive into Trump's now notorious bloodbath comments in a speech last weekend in Dayton, Ohio. The short clip was put out by the Biden campaign, and it looked really very, very bad, and a lot of people were responding to that short clip. Trump did seem very much to be predicting politically motivated violence if he loses this election.
Now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole... That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it.
But if you look at the lead up to that comment, it does make it very clear, at least it did to most people, that he is actually talking about an economic bloodbath.
If you're listening, President Xi, and you and I are friends, but he understands the way I deal, those big monster car manufacturing plants that you're building in Mexico right now, and you think you're going to get that, you're going to not hire Americans, and you're going to sell the cars to us. No, we're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars. If I get elected, now if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole... That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it. But they're not going to sell those cars.
So clearly talking about Chinese cars manufactured in Mexico coming into the United States. But opponents of Trump maintain that the context that really matters here isn't what he was saying about the automotive industry. It is his history of inciting and excusing violence from his supporters and the rhetoric he uses and the threat that he poses to democracy by consistently lying about his loss in the 2020 election.
Yeah, and there was no finer example of that than how Trump's rally that day began. It began with Trump paying tribute to a choir of convicted January 6 criminals singing the national anthem.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the horribly and unfairly treated January 6th hostages.
Wow. So, just to be clear, that was Trump paying his respects to people who've been convicted by a jury of their peers of rioting or of assaulting police or whatever in order to break into the Capitol so they can intimidate politicians into overturning an election result. Trump is in fact treating these convicted criminals like they're heroes. Now, is that what you're talking about, John?
Yeah, pretty much, Chaz, pretty much. Professor John Carey at Dartmouth University is co-founder of Brightline Watch, which monitors threats to democracy in the United States, including both incitements to violence and the spread of misinformation. So his perspective on all of this should be rather interesting. John Carey, thank you for being with us on the Fireside Chat.
Thanks for having me.
So, generally speaking, Professor, the fact-checkers have determined that the Biden campaign's interpretation that Trump was talking about a literal bloodbath was misleading, and that much more plausible was the Trump campaign's interpretation that he was talking about an economic bloodbath or a bloodbath for the automotive industry. Do you agree with that assessment?
You know, I think audiences differ. If you're sympathetic to Trump, you're going to put his comments in context. In the broader context, he was talking about the auto industry, although he stopped in that specific reference and he referred to a bloodbath. He didn't refer to an economic bloodbath or, sort of a jobs bloodbath. He referred to a bloodbath for the country. Sympathetic audience will look at it and put it in context, but there's plenty of unsympathetic audiences to Trump who are quick to ascribe other motives and other meanings. And so, like everything in American politics these days, we're deeply polarized, and that's true for our interpretations of pretty much everything that gets said.
Professor, let me put an argument to you that I have heard quite a lot over the last 3 days, and that is, this is a dog whistle. Maybe Trump was, at the exact moment he was speaking, referring to the automotive industry, but the real reason he was using words like bloodbath was to ramp up the violent rhetoric for his supporters. How do you respond to that argument?
I think there could be some element of that. So there's a sliver of his supporters who really would enjoy that kind of rhetoric and respond to it. I think he could have been sort of killing two birds with one stone at the other end of the spectrum. there are a lot of listeners who ran straight for the fainting couch when they heard that term, and I think that actually serves Trump's purposes well as well. Whenever he's sort of when the libs are clutching their pearls, or I'm mixing metaphors here, but when they're outraged, he's happy and his supporters are happy as well. So I think that the same statement can play differently to a number of different audiences, and I think Trump is an expert at doing exactly that.
Professor, some might argue, well, look, Trump and his supporters take clips of Joe Biden out of context all the time to try and prove that he is too old or he is demented. So isn't this fair game to take clips of Trump out of context if it goes towards making a broader point?
Fair game is pretty loosely interpreted in American politics. I suppose in that sense, yeah, it's fair game. It's going to happen for sure. People are going to put their most favorable slant on any communications, and certainly the Democrats are going to edit their video, their commercials, their text for the most outrageous Trump statements, and the Republicans are going to edit anything Joe Biden says in order to try to reinforce that narrative that he's old and no longer up to the job.
Now, Trump says 20 dubious things per rally, and it's so common for political campaigns to try and make some viral outrage out of something that the other side says. So why do you think the media jumps so hard on this phrase in particular, the bloodbath phrase? I mean, there could have been 100 different grabs that they got excited about. Why this one?
Potential for political violence is on a lot of people's minds right now, and people are on a hair trigger for any language that points in that direction. Overwhelming majorities of Americans reject the prospect of political violence, but it doesn't take a huge number to create meaningful violence. We saw that on January 6th, 2021. People are concerned about a repeat, and so people are hypersensitive to that. I think that's the straightforward explanation. And again, because Trump and his supporters know that there's heightened sensitivity, I think you're going to see them constantly walking up to the line, because when they can prompt what looks like an overreaction, that's perfect for their narrative. So we're going to see people tiptoeing around this, I think, from now until November.
So the fact checkers say that Trump was talking about the economy, not a literal bloodbath. Do consumers of information, though, through the media, take notice of fact checks? Do they change people's minds, or are people really just looking for information out there that confirms their previously held belief?
Yeah, that's a hard one to answer. I know we do experiments. We can and we do experiments where we expose people to fact checks, and they work. When you put the corrective information in front of them, their beliefs become more accurate. But those experiments tend to have the element of you're grabbing people by the collar and saying, you're going to look at this material. And we can do that in the lab, or we can do it in a survey experiment. But in the wild, it's not clear that really is a good description of how people encounter corrective material. People tend to encounter material that reinforces their own priors. And so it's fact checks can work, but it's not clear that the New York Times correcting Donald Trump's misstatements or Fox correcting Joe Biden's misstatements actually change very many opinions, because the audience that's already listening is on board.
What role do resources play in all this? And what I mean by that is that the media doesn't have the resources to investigate and dig up a real story. And at the same time, they're more dependent than ever on clicks, and they're financially strapped, so they're more dependent on making their readers angry, and so they're more likely to report on viral outrage stories like this one.
Yeah, I think as newsrooms are more strapped, the tendency to rely on what's available online for content goes up. You talked about resources. I think the flip side of that, also pushing in the same direction, is that at this stage of the campaign season in particular, so much of what we see and what we see amplified is about fundraising. And these kinds of comments the most inflammatory ones are the ones that are most effective at driving fundraising among base supporters. That's where the campaigns are right now, is they're converting content into email appeals. And so there's an incentive there as well to lean hard into the more inflammatory stuff as they're building their war chests. As the campaign season proceeds and more low engagement voters start to pay attention to it, it may be that we see that pattern diminish a bit, and the campaigns maybe will be appealing more toward the moderate center. But at this stage, the people who are really paying attention are the most committed, and those tend to be the people who are most extreme.
So, Professor, these bloodbath comments immediately got cut into a Biden campaign attack ad against Donald Trump, alongside images of Charlottesville and January the 6th, embedding that interpretation, that misinterpretation, many believe, of what Trump actually said. Are there any standards that are applied to political advertising in the United States, or can you pretty much say whatever you like?
Our First Amendment creates a really broad range of flexibility for campaigns to say what they want, to edit things as they want. It's just funny. I've done work in other countries where, in the absence of an analog to our First Amendment free speech protections, campaign regulators can be much more aggressive in reining in campaign speech. You're not going to see much of that in the United States. Our First Amendment provides enormous protections, and you're going to see creative interpretations of what candidates said, and those creative interpretations are going to be used for campaign ads and for fundraising.
Professor John Carey, thank you for having a fireside chat with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, in the interest of getting our facts straight, let's talk stats. Trump has been trying to make crime an election issue for years.
There is no longer respect for the law, and there certainly is no order. Our country is now a cesspool of crime. We have blood, death, and suffering on a scale once unthinkable because of the Democrat Party's effort to destroy and dismantle law enforcement all throughout America.
And there's good reason to try that tactic. 63% of Americans believe crime is a very or extremely serious problem, more than any time this century. So people are receptive to that message. And that's interesting because when you look at the actual crime figures, they're not so cut and dry. Take the murder rate, for example. There is no doubt there was a sizable bump in the murder rate around 2020. But lately, despite people's concerns, the murder rate does seem to be falling again. Okay, how about violent crime overall then? Well, it too had a bump in 2020, except the violent crime bump was much, much smaller. And lately, the falls in violent crime have been more significant as well. And as for property crime, i.e. theft and burglary, well, that's been on a long ride downwards for a while, with almost no interruption. So that doesn't match with people's fears at all. Now, there are some qualifiers there. First of all, murder figures, they are super accurate. It's hard to hide bodies, but violent crime and property crime, they depend on who actually reports them. There could be a bump in unreported crime that we don't know about. Also, those graphs still don't have the final stats from 2022 or 2023 yet, but thankfully, there are some more refined 2023 figures that just dropped now, as well as some early 2024 figures. So why don't we find out about those figures from the person who supplied those graphs before, probably the most respected crime statistician in America, I would say, the former CIA analyst and criminologist, Jeff Asher.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jeff, what are the latest crime figures that have dropped, and can we project any trends because of them?
We have to caveat with the numbers are preliminary. The FBI won't come out with its final year-end estimates until October of this year. And we can never be certain with crime trends. The data we do have from the FBI comes from about 13,000 out of around 18,000 agencies nationally. It covers about 80% of the US population. And it shows from that population a 13% decline in murder, a 6% decline in overall violent crime, which is aggravated assault, felony assault, murder, rape, and robbery, and a 4% decline in property crime, which is theft, auto theft, and burglary. And so the murder number is the largest 1-year decline ever recorded. So, and it's by far the one year largest decline. So all it has to do is get close to the number that they've reported from 13,000 agencies, and the US will have seen the largest decline ever recorded. The violent crime decline is large, but not historically so, though the figures suggest that 2023's number is the crime rate in the US in terms of violent crime was either the lowest or the top 2 or 3 lowest violent crime rates ever recorded, or recorded since the late 1960s at least.
So I take your disclaimer seriously, but would you say these are at least worth paying attention to? This isn't just media sensationalism, yeah?
Absolutely. What it does, rather than give us the exact figures, it gives us the contours of the crime trends nationally. And it shows that the US had a extremely large decline in murder last year, a decently large decline in violent crime, a decently large decline in property crime, with sort of the fly in the ointment being a large increase in auto theft that was driven by social media videos that showed how to steal certain models of Kias and Hyundais easier, that because of US regulations don't have certain technology features that make them harder to steal elsewhere.
Oh, so do we know for a fact that the spike in auto theft was centered around those particular car models, Kias and Hyundais?
We never know anything for a fact in crime data, but the cities that do have that data publicly available or have made that data available to analyze make it pretty clear in those cities it's huge surges in Kias and Hyundais being stolen. And the timing in most places strongly suggests that basically this video was on TikTok for 2 weeks in July 2022. And immediately afterward, you saw this huge surge. And I'm talking about basically a almost vertical line in some cities in terms of doubling or tripling almost overnight the number of auto thefts. And so you can't say for certain because we're not necessarily capturing that data, but it's about as clear of a slam dunk case that you can make as any case you can make when analyzing crime data.
So why do you think we're seeing these trends? What's causing the fall in crime? Or is nothing causing it? It just happens?
Something causes it. And I should say rather some things cause it. There's probably not one explanation. I have to caveat this answer always with criminologists aren't sure why murder and violent crime fell in the 90s. So it's very soon to the event happening to have really strong proven explanations. I think that the most compelling answer has to do with COVID and ending sort of the emergency phase. COVID in late 2022, first parts of 2023, went sort of to the background of everyday American life. And so what that did is it removed some of those stresses of COVID. You know, you're not as worried about some kid in your child's class testing positive, and then all of a sudden you need to figure out 2 weeks of childcare, or your coworker exposed you, and all of a sudden you can't work for the next 2 weeks, and how are you going to earn your living? Those stresses, I think, probably went away in the end of 2022. And so that probably helped to interrupt this sort of cycle of violence that started in the summer of 2020. The other thing was that government spending started again. Local governments were hiring again. State governments were hiring and spending money again. And philanthropies and nonprofits were getting back to operating as they had before COVID. And this allows these tools that you would expect to be the tools that would interrupt cycles of violence, not right away, but gradually. These tools were back in the tool shed. These were, arrows in your quiver of arrows. You now had the ability to use these things that you didn't have in 2020 and 2021, and probably didn't cause the spike, but were the absence of these factors likely sustained the spike over that 1 to 2 year period. And that, I think, is the most compelling answer. I don't know that it's still a hypothesis. I don't know how well that will hold up over time. In 10 years, we may be talking about certainty of a whole different answer that we can't even imagine right now.
Jeff, we see so often in the news suggestions of a wave of thefts. Is that just a beat up, or is it only restricted to small areas? Or could the stats be missing a crime wave somehow from non-reporting maybe?
the answer is kind of yes, all of the above to that question. There's no evidence of an increase in theft in the reported crime data. And when I talk about property crime and violent crime, I'm usually pretty careful to talk about reported violent crime and reported property crime, because we have survey data that shows somewhere around half of all violent crime goes unreported, especially systemically things like rape and sexual assault. And around a third of property crime is properly reported, which is even lower for theft and burglary and much higher for auto theft, because you need your insurance to get a new car. And so you'll report it to the police. The issue is that we don't have any data showing big surges in theft, but there's a very real possibility that there are tons of these incidents that aren't being reported. So the question is, are they being reported less often than before? Because in theory, if your theft number is flat, but you're having an increase in underreporting, then you're actually seeing an increase in theft. It just looks flat in the official data. There's not really evidence that we're seeing more underreporting nationally, but you can point to places like Seattle and New Orleans, places that have lost a lot of officers and have seen the response times increase significantly. And there's pretty clear evidence that as response times go up, the share of crimes that get effectively reported to the police show up on time, the person is there, they report the crime, that share goes down of effective reporting as response times go up. So you can certainly point to certain cities in 2023 and 2022 that probably had a larger share of incidents underreported, but the degree to which that's offset by other places like New Orleans, which actually had response times go down largely in 2023, had them really shoot up in 2022. Is that offset with Seattle, which saw response time shoot up in 2023 and likely saw underreporting shoot up? It's a really hard calculation to make. It's not something that we're well suited to describe on a national or even across dozens or hundreds of police departments.
Jeff Asher, thank you for joining the Fireside Chat.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I also asked Jeff if there was any recent data on crime by undocumented migrants. That's a big hot button issue right now.
Sure is.
He didn't really know, so I didn't include that in the edit. You can see his actual full answer on Facebook. It's still good. But I did want to talk about that a little because Trump has been making this in particular an election issue. And there are some things we do know about that question. Firstly, we know Customs arrested over 2 million people in fiscal year 2023. Just 0.3% of those people had a prior criminal conviction unrelated to their immigration status. Furthermore, we know researchers have found undocumented immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than American citizens. We're talking 14% less likely to be convicted of murder and 41% less likely to be convicted of any criminal offence. Other researchers also found undocumented migrants are less likely to be convicted of homicides, sexual assaults, violent crimes, property crimes, traffic, and drug violations. Now, you at home might be thinking, sure, but every single crime committed by someone who shouldn't be in America didn't have to happen, did it? That's fine. If that's your view, that makes sense. But we just need to be clear that this is absolute garbage.
We have a new category, migrant crime, and it's going to be more severe than violent crime and crime as we knew it, because we have millions and millions of people, and they came from prisons and jails. They came from mental institutions and insane asylums. No, they're not the same thing. An insane asylum is a mental institution on steroids. Okay? It's Silence of the Lambs. Okay? You know that. Hannibal Lecter. They're all being deposited into our country.
Remember, 0.3% have prior criminal records, and I'm pretty sure they're not Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah, and not only is that a completely false statement, it is a completely false statement that has been made repeatedly since the 1970s, when there were a few psychiatric institutions in Cuba that were deliberately emptied by Fidel Castro to put pressure on the Carter administration. And this talking point has been attached to illegal immigrants ever since. It was true for one brief period for a certain number of people who were coming across to Florida in 1979, and illegal arrivals in the United States have been tarnished with it ever since. It's appalling.
Well, let's get out of here.
Yeah, that is it for another Fireside Chat. We are off on a short break. We will be back with Planet America on Wednesday the 10th of April from 9 p.m. on ABC iView and YouTube, around 9:50 on ABC TV.
And do not forget the Pet Podcast and all the usual pod places.
Bye-bye.